say that there is a kind of painful, there was a New York Times article, and this was about climate, that used the word Cassandra Freude, which is the feeling that you get for being right about things going terribly wrong. And I think that we have been in motion towards both our civic crisis and our journalism crisis for years. And the reality is that while I wish we could have changed certain things sooner, here we are. And so we have to move ahead. And what I mean by things having been in motion, what we see with COVID and uprisings is that communities of color have been consistently underserved by news, not just including, but sometimes particularly, what we call public media, where public radio, which I'm re-entering as a host, and I'll talk about that in a second, has been a space where there's been a theory called over-serving the core, which is that you serve upper middle class white Americans who are donors, which then ends up alienating working class whites. You end up doing programming that basically pleases upper middle class and wealthy whites more than it connects with certain other groups. And so from my understanding, and I'm not picking on this station because it's the only one, but it's one where I have a good sense of the numbers, that in New York, which is roughly 2/3 Latino and people of color, 1/3 white, non-Hispanic white, that the audience for WNYC is the reverse, roughly 2/3 white, 1/3 Latino and people of color. Obviously, I used to work there at times. I saw heat maps of where the listenership was. There was very poor listenership in outer Brooklyn, Queens, Bronx, even parts of Staten Island. And so when you say, how do we get news to people to save their lives and to inform them about civics and to inform them that the census is nigh, that there are court challenges underway, but in less than 10 days, the census may be a wrap, depending on how the court challenges go. We have to ask how news is serving people. And this is not a today thing, a yesterday thing, or a last year thing. This is at least a decade, and usually more than that, decades of emphasis on over-serving the core, which means revenue generating audiences, which means generally white, upper middle class and wealthier people. And we have to take responsibility for where we are now. We have to take responsibility for the idea that not just in public media, but in commercial media, we have chosen audiences that can pay revenue in the short term, but we have eroded the connections that we have to many different types of people. I have a very dear friend who's from Eastern Ohio, and the last election cycle, when I went interviewing people across the country, I went to interview Trump voters in Eastern Ohio, and she connected me to a lot of people. I also spent time with her mother, who's a Trump voter, but she connected me to a bunch of people in the local parties, and I saw their enthusiasm and I saw their passion, and I saw, frankly, how much more organized and passionate they were than some of the Democratic constituents. That's a longer story for another time, but one little thing is that the Clinton campaign in Eastern Ohio, their messaging was supposed to be very top down, and it wasn't connecting with Black voters, and the Black volunteers just rewrote the entire playbook and just said, we're not following the script because it's not working. So that gives you a sense. And one of the things I thought was interesting, okay, I am digressing, is that the Republicans in Eastern Ohio spoke to people about what they cared about. That candidate Trump had a very decentralized idea of messaging, and people thought it was disorganized. It actually was pretty brilliant, because it allowed people, like, if you wanted to talk about the Mexicans, you could talk about the Mexicans. If you wanted to talk about the steel plants, you could talk about the steel plants. If you wanted to talk about abortion, you could talk about abortion. So all of which is to say, my life as a journalist has been determined by deep listening to people as I report on them, but also deep listening at institutions. even when I myself have been someone who was not listened to at institutions, whether it goes back to Newsweek, which is where the Central Park jogger case, where I was when the Central Park jogger case happened, or it goes to different eras in public radio, or to 538, which was my last, full-time journalism job, where Nate Silver accused me of cherry picking the facts when I brought up in October of 2015, racial animus as a key driver of the election. And it was only 5 months later, when he decided it was a key driver of the election, that we were allowed to talk about it. And he and I have spoken by phone. He didn't particularly he didn't deny it, but he didn't take responsibility for how that affected the news. But I am unbought and unbossed, as they say. And so I am here to have the difficult conversations that other people who work full-time in newsrooms can't always have. And as a grant maker now, I find that I am empowered to build a coalition of people and entities who are as passionate about equity as I am, and as passionate about American civic life as I am. And these are people of many different races, ethnicities, and although I'm a domestic program officer, geography. So there's a group called the Digital Youth Resiliency Project in West Virginia, which works on tracking the recruitment efforts of white extremists to reach local teens and youth, and interfaces with entities like public health entities. And it's a really interesting project, kind of a non-traditional journalism project with a mix of investigative reporting, data analytics, and again, sort of a focus on civic and public health. Overwhelmingly white population, incubated at the University of West Virginia, which has a great College of Media. We have indigenous organizations like Kalanick Broadcasting, which is the multi-state public radio network that is indigenous run, with hubs in Anchorage and in New Mexico. We have Black serving organizations, multiracial organizations, but the thing that holds them all together is a commitment to equity, that no one owns the story, that the truth is a collective search. And, I believe that one of the reasons we have no truth right now is because so many different types of truth were suppressed, and people who wanted to wage disinformation warfare used that as a wedge into destroying the very concept of truth. I believe that there is truth, but I also believe, for example, as good of a reporter as I am, I'm not going to find the truth on my own. I can contribute to a collective endeavor of creating a shared truth. And it certainly helps over the decades. I mean, it helped that I had a family that really made me, I wanted to just read Lord of the Rings, which I still love, but they were like, why don't you read some history too? I was like, really? But, that helped me. It helped me to be a field reporter and travel around the country. There's many different things that have helped me be someone who can seek the truth. But the reality is, I think that truth requires, in the larger sense, the friction of people from different backgrounds with different ideas of the world and different experiences clashing with each other, and then coming to some kind of consensus. So I'm not afraid of that sort of tension, but a lot of newsrooms are run like little dictatorships, where to challenge the person who is most powerful or the group that is most powerful, it can be a career ender.